Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing Who Was Better. The topic of this Who Was Better? Two tag teams that defined the mid to late 80s in WWF, two rivalries, two teams that are intertwined through marriage. We're talking about the British Bulldogs, Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith versus the Hart Foundation, Jim the Anvil Neidhart and the Hitman Bret Hart. Now for this, we're only going to consider their time as a team. So, Dynamite Kid's matches with Tiger Mask have no bearing on this. Bret Hart's multiple world championship reigns have no bearing on this. Davey Boy Smith's solo career, Jim Neidhart's solo career, you get the point. For this, we have 8 separate categories. In each category, we're going to grade the teams 1 to 5, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. At the end, we're going to total those points. The team with the most points wins. There is a chance at the end for 5 bonus points. We'll talk about that when we get there. Let's start it off. Our first category, technical wrestling. Now for this, I'm going to give both teams a 4. And a couple things I want to let you guys know. I do try to grade against the era and the company that they're in. So for instance, in this, we're talking about the mid-80s WWF. While I don't think there are many people ahead of them technical wise, I do think there are some in that era. Talking about your Ricky Steamboat, your Macho Man Randy Savages, others of that ilk. And it's kind of funny how these teams mirror each other, because where I would consider the weak link technically on both teams is the bigger guy on both teams. The Bulldogs, it would be Davey Boy, and for the Hart Foundation, it would be Neidhart. Not that they're bad, as you can see, these are both a 4, but they're kind of the guys that hold it back from being a 5 here. Now, our next category, striking. For the Bulldogs are getting a 5. Bulldogs are hard-hitting, they were intense, they were quick. In an era where it was getting more and more hard to believe what was going on in WWF as being real, the Bulldogs come off as very real and very dangerous. That's why they get a 5 here. For the Hart Foundation, I'm giving them a 4. And again, it's not that they're bad, it's just they were actually really good and really well-rounded. I just think that the Bulldogs were just a step better just because of how proficient they were with it. Now our next category, how they perform as a heel. This one was a little bit difficult. We're going to start with the British Bulldogs, and I'm going to mention why. As you may guess, if you watched the Bulldogs in the 80s, it is extremely hard to judge them in this category, especially since the heavy majority of their run, they were not heels, and that would be their whole entire WWF run. Now, you start to mix in Stampede, where they weren't necessarily heels there, but they were a little more heelish, and where I'm taking this from is mostly the little bit of Japan that they did. And there, while I wouldn't call them a heel because it's Japan and it's a little different, I do think that there was heel tendencies that were being used, especially on Dynamite's end. Especially when you consider we were still in the era where Americans, Canadians were considered heels just from being foreign, kind of same as in America, Japanese wrestlers were considered heels just because they were Japanese. So with all that being said, I'm going to give the Bulldogs a 3. Like I said, there's no time in their career where they're heel, using dirty tactics, having a manager distract a referee, cheating behind a referee's back. There's more the time in Japan when they were more aggressive and more heel tendencies, and a little bit of the time in Stampede where, again, they were more aggressive. Not a quintessential heel. I don't want to mark them off too bad here because it's not really their fault. I mean, if you got the British Bulldogs and it's 1987, do you book them as a heel team? Obviously not. Now going over to the Hart Foundation, I'm giving the Hart Foundation a 5. They're one of the best heel teams of the era, and for the reasons I just mentioned that the Bulldogs didn't stand out being heels, the Hart Foundation was the exact opposite. They would cheat. They would go behind the referee's back. They would use Jimmy Hart's megaphone. They would take any dirty advantage that they could, whether that be a referee that cheated for them in Danny Davis, especially in their feud with the Bulldogs. I think they're probably, in my opinion, until Demolition comes into WWE, which is kind of in the middle of their run, I think they're the best heel team in WWE or WWF. And I use them interchangeably, so if you hear me see WWE and it's not error appropriate, I do apologize. Now going from that, how they perform as a babyface. As you may guess by what I just talked about with the Bulldogs and how hard it was to press them as heels, I'm giving these guys a 5. Much like the Hart Foundation, I think we're the quintessential heel tag team for a time in WWF. The British Bulldogs were the quintessential face tag team in the WWF, in my opinion. Whether it's them or the US Express or Strike Force, I give the Bulldogs a nod over all the rest of them just because, in my opinion, the Bulldogs are always in championship contention. And kind of one of the barometers when I think about this, and I know there's other face tag teams that got them, if you remember the LJN packs, the tag teams, it was the Hart Foundation, it was the Bulldogs. I think the Killer Bees had a tag team pack, and Volkov and the Sheik had a tag team pack, which if you look at it, 2 face teams, 2 heel teams. Now, as much as I like the Killer Bees, no one will ever say that the Killer Bees were pushed to the level that the British Bulldogs were. Like I said, I love the team, but let's face it, it's like having a favorite basketball team and you liken the 6th man off the bench, but your team has Michael Jordan. You can love that 6th man, you can love BJ Armstrong or Tony Kukoc or whoever it was at the time, but Michael Jordan's a man still. Well, in this case, that's the British Bulldogs. Now for the Hart Foundation, after they turned face, I'm giving the Hart Foundation a 4. In my opinion, and I still think they were very good, I think they lost a little of their luster as being a face tag team, and when I look back at it now, it really feels like their whole entire face run was just to set up Bret Hart going out on his own, which at some point looked inevitable and became inevitable because, I mean, he's Bret the Hitman Hart. We all know the career that he had after the Hart Foundation. We all know the talent he had even in the Hart Foundation. So for that reason, I think they weren't quite as great of a face team as they were a heel team, in my opinion. Now going to our next category, probably both teams' weakest point in their whole catalog, and I'm going to give them both the same score. For promos, both teams are getting a 2. I wouldn't say that these were totally unwatchable when you came to promos, and like I said, grading for the era, there is way worse in the 1980s, but here's some things that go against both. The Bulldogs, Dynamite, I can't honestly remember a promo where Dynamite lit this world on fire. He was just kind of there. And Davey Boy's the same way. Davey Boy was had a little bit more fire to him, but they kind of suffered a little bit because they were a little bit harder to understand. And let's face it, when you grade it against the era, you have in the same company at the same time the Macho Man, Roddy Piper, Hulk Hogan, all the legendary managers, whether it be Slick, Jimmy Hart, Bobby Heenan, Lou Albano, Freddie Blassie. You start to realize that they're subpar, especially when graded against their time frame. For the Hart, same thing. I do think, and this is funny, out of all 4 of the men during their time as tag teams, that Jim Neidhart was the best promo, and it has a lot to do, he kind of had that same thing that the Road Warrior Hawk would have, where he would hit the home run at the end and do his cackle laugh, where Bret, I don't think Bret was ever super confident in promos, even when he went on to be one of, if not the biggest star in wrestling for a time. I don't think he ever got to the point where he was fully confident in his promo ability, and you could definitely see it during the tag team era. You could see it a little bit more in his singles run, but like I said, they're both getting it 2. In our next category, they're going to get both the same score again. This one's for presentation. I'm giving both teams a 5. Both of them had great music for their time. Both of them had great gear. Whether it be the Bulldogs in the red, white, and blue with the Union Jack or the powder blue, it was instantly knowing who they were and what they were about. Whether it be the Hart Foundation, obviously the pink and black attack. Even though early in their run, they didn't have one set color. I remember them wearing everything from black and yellow to black and red to red tights with a black singlet, or even the baby blue, which I know everybody remembers that as one of their alternate uniforms. I say that like they're a sports team, but they definitely are known more for their pink and black attack, which makes sense. Like I said, you know the music for both teams. They're both very identifiable. You don't mix either of these teams up with any other team. That's why they get a 5 for presentation on both ends. Now for charisma, the Bulldogs are going to get a 4. There's something that drew you to them, even though there was it's kind of funny to say a language barrier when they're speaking English. Maybe how can I say this, a dialect barrier or a accent barrier to them. They still managed to connect with you, and they still had everything that would draw the fans into it. There was a reason why the fans loved the team. That's why, in my opinion, they get a 4 here. Now for the Hart Foundation, I'm giving them a 3. Like I said about Brett, and he kind of is the one that drags him down during the time, I don't think he had the confidence to be as charismatic as he would become. I don't think he was able to be a world beater here. There's another reason why they're with Jimmy Hart, because Jimmy Hart, one of the great talkers of the time, made up for what they lacked here and made up for their, in my opinion, lack of charisma. They're not horrible, but they're right at the middle of the road in my opinion. Now last but not least, big game performance. This is yet another category where I'm going to give both the teams the same score, and if you watched them at the time, you know what the score is going to be. They're both getting a 5. When I think of 80s tag team wrestling, especially when I think of the WWF, I think of the Bulldogs and the Hart Foundation. I put them right up there with all of the great teams of the decade, whether that be the Rock and Roll Express, the Midnight Express, the Road Warriors, Demolition, the Freebirds. There's so many teams that I would have liked to see these teams go up against. I would have loved to see a Hart Foundation Rock and Roll Express fight. I would have loved to see the Midnights versus the Bulldogs, or the Freebirds versus the Bulldogs, or the Freebirds versus either of them. We did get to see some of the other matchups with the other teams I mentioned, but for this specifically, I would put these two. I mean, when it comes down to it, you have a main event and you have either the Hart Foundation or the British Bulldogs, or both in it, or there's a high profile match. When it comes down to it, these teams always excelled, always gave their best in the biggest performances under the brightest lights. That's why they both get a 5. Now totaling everything up, the Bulldogs end up with 33, the Hart Foundation 32. But wait, here's where the bonus comes in. Every week, in this case 2 weeks ago, unfortunately I didn't tape anything last week. Thank you for sticking with me, by the way. Every week I put up a poll on every Wednesday, basically asking you guys, who do you think is better of the 2 people or 2 teams that are going to be on the next week's video? Well, the answer for this poll and the winner of the 5 bonus points from that, the Hart Foundation. Giving the Hart Foundation a new total of 37, putting them over the hump with the come from behind win with your assistance. You guys are the Jimmy Hart of this. So congratulations to Brett and Jim and Jimmy. Got to give them the total package. I honestly think when you look at this, I think a lot of people look at it, and as the years go by and by, Bret Hart seems to be growing in mythical status more and more, which kudos to him. He deserves every bit of the flowers he gets. But as the years go on, I think Dynamite and Davey Boy, their star power, their legendary status diminishes a little bit. And it's kind of weird when you think about it, especially being someone of my age, where Davey Boy and Dynamite were considered 2 of the best wrestlers in the world. Bret too, and Neidhart too. Neidhart's not a slouch. Kind of feel like he's a little bit of the lost man when we talk about historical relevance. So I do think there is a little bit of a recency bias in that poll, but hey, that's why it's there. It's to get a different opinion other than mine added into this. So once again, congratulations to the Hart Foundation. Stay tuned to the posts page here on YouTube every Wednesday. This Wednesday I'm going to post a new poll. You can vote in it as you see it. With this one, you were the difference between the Hart Foundation winning and losing. I want to say thank you again for tuning in. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and you've been watching Who Was Better.